Hello everyone, I'm going to take you through a strut replacement on a 2018 F-150. This one's leaking oil real bad. So we'll start off by pulling this ABS wire out of the way. Pulling the brake hanger. Pull the vacuum line for the IWE. Pull the cap for the axle nut. Remove the axle nut. Tap on a little bit, make sure it's not seized in the bearing. Pull this caliper out of the way. Put a lug nut on there so this brake rotor doesn't fall on my foot. We'll hang this caliper off to the side. Remove the rotor. Pull the sway bar link nut. Pull the outer tie rod nut. Remove the tie rod end. Remove the upper control arm nut. Leave the nut on it for now. Pry the control arm down, remove the nut. Let the control arm swing up. Pull the knuckle out. Pull the lower shock nuts. Pry this lower control arm down. We'll let it wedge on the sway bar link to keep it held down. Swing the axle off to the side. Pry down on the lower control arm to free up the lower end of the strut. And remove the 3 upper strut nuts. And then remove the strut. Simple as that. I'm going to apply a little bit of penetrant on the strut bolt. There's the part number for the new strut. This is left front. It's possible that both sides are the same. I'm only going to do one strut on this one. The other one's fine. You can do them in pairs if you like, but this is a used vehicle, so it only gets done what's needed. I'm going to clean up the spring, and with the paint pen I'm going to put a mark. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it, so when I put the new strut in I can center it up with that mark. Clean the top of the mount. Position the strut in the compressor. And we're going to compress the spring. Make sure it's all lined up in there good. And compress this so the lower end of the strut, you can move it. Then remove the top nut. And this one, the whole strut wants to spin. So we'll pull this nut off by hand. And remove the strut. Now Ford actually calls this a shock absorber with spring. You can see there where it's leaking oil out of the top seal. We'll clean this oil up before we put the new shock absorber in. Guide it up in there. And this lower pedestal spins. You'll line it up with the spring on the bottom. And I'll index this with my mark. Just kind of eyeball it. The upper strut mount studs, there's a lot of play in them, so it doesn't have to be perfect. We'll snug that up by hand. Do one last adjustment, clock it until I got it lined up with my mark. Then we'll tighten this upper nut down. And I'll put the impact on it. Give it a couple wraps with that, make sure it's good and tight. And loosen up the tension and pull the strut out. And assembly is pretty much the reverse of removal. Guide the strut up in there, line the 3 studs up. Install your nuts. Pry the lower control arm down. Guide the 2 studs into the holes. Position the axle back into the IWE. Swing the knuckle back up. Tighten up the upper nuts. Tighten up the lower strut nuts. Tighten the sway bar link. And when you move the knuckle back up, make sure the axle splines and engages with the IWE. Make sure it indexes in there. It'll kind of pop in there. Pry the lower control arm down onto the knuckle. Install the nut. I'm going to put a vacuum gauge on this IWE just to make sure it works before I put it back together. If the IWE's broken, this is a perfect time to change it. This one here is working. Tighten up the axle nut. Put the rotor back on. Install the cap. Reinstall the brake caliper. Tighten up the bolts. Install the integrated wheel end vacuum line. Run the wheel speed sensor wiring back up. Put the bolts in for the brake line bracket. And this one is pretty much done. It's a fairly easy job. All right, thanks for watching everyone, and we'll see you in the next video.